Hey guys, this is John. All right, high drama in Moscow today as we saw the final round of the 2016 Candidates Tournament. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 2 weeks, you'll know that this is the event that determines who gets to play Magnus Carlsen in the FIDE World Championship match in November. And after 13 rounds, only these two guys that you see pictured, Sergey Karjakin and Fabiano Caruana, could possibly take the lone qualifier spot to play Magnus. And as it turns out, these two guys were playing each other in the 14th and final round. You can't get much more dramatic than that. I think that goes without saying. The tournament circumstances were a little bit weird because these guys both had 7.5 out of 13 going into this round, and you also had Vishy Anand with 7 out of 13, lurking a half point behind. So you might think if Karjakin and Caruana draw and Anand wins his game, they all reach 8 out of 13. What happens then? Well, the way the tiebreakers worked out, Anand was totally out. Even if that result happened, he had no chance based on the tiebreakers. But the result of the Anand-Svidler game could actually impact Karjakin versus Caruana in the event of a draw. The only favorable result for Caruana would be if Anand actually beat Svidler, and they all had that tie at 8 out of 13. Then Caruana would actually win on tiebreaks. But if Anand drew or lost to Svidler, then a draw would be sufficient for Karjakin. And I know that's a lot to keep track of. I'm going to post that exact wording of the tiebreak regulations in the comments so you can take a look at it. Suffice it to say that only the very unlikely event of an Anand win with black over Svidler would help Fabiano Caruana in this game. Otherwise, Sergey Karjakin with white basically had draw odds because you expect most games to be drawn at the highest level. So keep that in mind as we go through this game. That puts Caruana in an especially difficult spot because he basically had to win this game with black to order. I don't think for a second Caruana was sitting around in his hotel room thinking to himself, well, how can I play this safe and then hope that Anand wins against Svidler with black? No, he was going to take his destiny into his own hands. So let's jump into the analysis now. So Karjakin opened with e4. He's been playing a little bit of everything this tournament. He played knight f3 and also d4 in previous rounds. And in round 12, he actually played e4 on a different occasion to beat Topalov in a nice game. And here he goes back to his bread and butter. Karjakin is a native e4 player, and I feel like he's most comfortable in these positions. Fabiano answers with the Sicilian defense. We could expect nothing less in a decisive final round encounter. I think Karjakin's decision might also have been made easier in the sense that Caruana's repertoire with black against e4 is a little narrow. He exclusively plays e5 and c5 these days at the elite level, it seems. I saw back in 2014 he was playing a little bit of French, but he mostly plays double king pawn or Sicilian and hardly anything else. So Karjakin could just prepare for those two openings and not worry about anything else. So we get a Sicilian, no Berlin Wall for this particular game. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. These are all standard moves in the open Sicilian. And here, Caruana decided to play d6, entering the classical Sicilian. Now, he has experience with e5. This is the Sveshnikov variation, where black attacks the knight on d4. And this might look like a more aggressive try for black, but the problem is, after knight db5, there's a lot of forcing variations that Karjakin undoubtedly knows quite well. Karjakin is known for his opening prep, and he's been playing these lines for white for ages. And these type of forcing lines are not suited to playing for a win with black, because an experienced player with white can kind of bully you with the white pieces and try to navigate the game towards safer waters, almost by force. That's kind of the reality of playing a sharper opening with black. So Caruana decides to play d6, and now we've transposed into the classical Sicilian. Karjakin answers with bishop g5, the so-called Richter-Rauser variation. The classical Sicilian was really popular in the 1990s, but bishop g5 is kind of the move that put it out of business for a while. And I happen to kind of like the classical Sicilian for black. I've never studied it in the depth that it deserves, but I like the unbalanced positions it produces. And having looked at it a little bit, I can say that bishop g5 is the only move that truly troubles me. So not surprised to see Karjakin play it. It's considered to be the strongest move against C6, D6 on the previous move. So Caruana plays E6. Karjakin plays Queen D2, preparing queenside castling. And here, Caruana decides to play A6. Bishop E7 is another popular move, whereupon Black can try to castle short ASAP. But Caruana plays A6 instead. Karjakin castles long. And now Bishop D7. This is kind of a trendy line. I must confess that I don't know all the nuances of this line, but in playing Bishop D7, Black does gain the ability to play B5. The knight would no longer be hanging. The bishop is protecting it. And for now, he's delaying the development of the bishop to E7. Karjakin plays F4, and Black responds with H6. So another alternative here is B5, and this is the so-called Kojal suicide variation, which I think has one of the coolest names in chess, the Kojal suicide variation, named after Grandmaster Kojal, who I believe is a Croatian grandmaster. And the type of pawn structure that this move B5 can produce is very similar to what happened in the game, because White usually takes on F6, and Black recaptures with the G-pawn, interestingly enough. And we'll see that this is the same pawn structure that we get in this encounter. But first, Caruana throws in this H6 move. Karjakin plays the bishop back to H4. And now Black decides to go for B5. So this is kind of like the Kojal suicide variation delayed by one move. Alternatives here, Black can also try G5, which really shakes things up. There's also bishop E7, but it seems like B5 is going to be one of the ways to try to play for a win without getting too crazy yet. I mean, you could understand that a move like G5 is going to start forcing matters. So B5 was played, and now Karjakin takes on F6. Bishop takes F6. And you'll notice I gave this move an exclamation point, but as a thinking player, you might ask yourself, if bishop takes F6 is good here, why didn't White play it a couple moves ago? Or sorry, actually just one move ago, right here after H6. So if you want to try to figure out why bishop takes F6 is better after B5, try to do that now, and you can pause your video if you like. Okay, so this is a bit of a subtlety, but after bishop takes F6, if Black takes with the queen, as you might think he would want to do if he intends to keep his pawn structure intact, then White has this strong move E5. And after D takes E5, there's knight D takes B5, with a sudden attack on the bishop on D7. Note that if the pawn is still on B7, so after H6 here, the pawn remains on the B7 square. If White were to go for the same thing, take, queen takes, E5, take here, there's not a devastating discovery. You could still play knight DB5, I suppose, but after queen D8, Black should be able to cover D7, and they're also covering C7. They're not even losing a pawn. So that's the kind of difference that if you're going to play a sharp line of the Sicilian, you have to be aware of, which I'm sure these guys are. So bishop H4, B5, and now Karjakin makes this about-face decision and plays bishop takes F6. So since queen takes F6 is running into E5, Caruana accepts this pawn structure with G takes F6. And now you can kind of see the battleground being laid. Black has this compromised pawn structure, but there is some advantage to having the pawn on F6. You do control E5 particularly well. You'll see that this is an important square in the game. And Black also does have the two bishops to show for his trouble. The big question mark for Black is their king. And if you look at the board right now and think about where the king could possibly go, neither side looks particularly appealing. You know, Black castling short would be pretty crazy with the G-file open, and the queen side is also looking kind of airy as well. So in these Kojal suicide variation style positions, Black often has to roll with their king in the center and see what happens. So Karjakin plays F5. A good move, pressuring E6. This is a common device for White, advancing the pawn and creating some tension here. White does give up some control over E5, but the pressure here is worth it. Note that if Black were to respond with a bad move, E5, then White could move this knight away, and the other knight on C3 has a prime opportunity to jump to D5 in the future. So in a lot of games, Black will try to keep this pawn on E6, even though White is constantly threatening to capture it. And that's what occurred here. Caruana played queen b6. There's some other moves that are played. h5 is also played. E5, we already kind of discussed the deficiency of that move. So queen b6 putting pressure on d4. Karjakin takes on e6, threatening the bishop. Black recaptures. And now he takes on c6. As white in this game and basically having draw odds in the event of the expected result in Svidler versus Anand, I noticed that Karjakin seemed to play this game a little bit more simply than he may have otherwise. And I think this knight takes c6 is a good move, period. But it also plays well into his strategy of maybe keeping a draw in hand. So Caruana took with the queen. It was also possible to take with the bishop and try to keep the queen on the dark squares here. So queen takes c6, bishop d3, just developing. Black plays h5. And here, black is threatening to play bishop h6, skewering the white queen to the king. So Karjakin plays an utterly standard move for open Sicilian positions. He just moves his king one square to the left, kind of skirting the bishop h6 idea. And now black plays b4, chasing the knight. It was also possible to attack the queen right away, bishop h6. I think I found some encounters where this was played. But he decides to go b4, hitting the knight. Knight e2. And this pawn is now under attack on b4. So naturally, black's going to want to defend it. He plays queen c5. And here, Karjakin decides to play rook hf1. So this move makes a lot of sense. He's hitting the pawn on f6 with tempo, and including the only piece that isn't participating yet. But there was a stronger move for white here. And I'm going to challenge you to try to find this move. If you want to pause your video and figure out what white could have played here, you can do so now. Okay, so here, white had the option to play the striking pawn advance, e5. And this had been played before. You can see in this game, Prenstetter versus our main man, Kojal, back in 1988. And this is a typical line-opening pawn sacrifice in this particular line of the Sicilian. And actually for a lot of Sicilians, white playing e4, e5. So in doing so, white opens the bishop. And just to show you some possibilities from here, let's say black takes with the f-pawn. Then white can play queen g5, cutting off the black king from escaping over to the d8 square. And white's already threatening bishop g6. And if, say, bishop e7, white can go queen g7, hitting the rook. Note that black could not castle now to connect the rooks because the bishop on e7 would be hanging. So after something like rook f8, rook hf1, take, black's king is stuck in the center. And it just seems to me, after playing a few more computer-approved moves, that white gets a big attack and probably even wins their pawn back. You can see that black's king is still stranded and black's coordination is lacking. So e5 could have the effect of tearing open some lines. We just saw what would happen if e5, f takes e5. If queen takes e5, I think also a check or maybe even a calmer move like rook he1, as played in that aforementioned Prenstetter versus Kojal game, would provide white great compensation. I know the computer liked something like this. And then with the white knight looking to jump to either d4 or f4, discovered attack on the queen, pressure on e6. White has more than enough compensation for the pawn. Black is in dire straits here. And the only other capture that's possible after e5 would be d takes e5, but you might have seen that this would just end disastrously for black. Actually, it's checkmate on the next move, no matter if the king goes to d8 or e7. Queen takes d7 as mate. So I wonder if Karjakin just completely missed e5 or he didn't want to complicate the game early. It is just a good move. So it's kind of surprising that he didn't seize the opportunity to play this move. So he plays rook hf1. Black plays bishop h6, attacking the queen in reply. Queen e1 is the response. And now a5. So advancing a little bit on the queen side. Also defending the pawn on b4 a bit more. I don't believe that black wants their queen defending this pawn on b4 indefinitely. I think the queen's best destination is e5 in these type of structures. So I'm sure Caruana was trying to prepare queen e5. You could imagine if black was able to play the bishop back to g7 and then f5, they might get a quick attack on b2. I noticed that Sagar Shah, who was commentating this game for chessbase.com, also pointed out that fact. So a5. And here, Karjakin makes a good decision, I think. You might be wondering, what's the status of that pawn on f6? Well, if he takes that pawn, and this is, again, a line Shah looks at, if rook takes f6, then black can get the bishop onto this desired diagonal. So bishop g7, hitting the rook. And then after rook f3, queen e5, he sets up this battery we just talked about, threatening mate on b2. Let's say c3, and now Shah gives a4 with unclear possibilities. Black is down a pawn, but they've got some pressure, and white is kind of getting pushed back here. I don't think white can think too much about their own ambitions. They have to tend to their king first. And needing a win, I'm sure this is a scenario Caruana would have liked to bring about. So Karjakin did not take the pawn on f6. He instead played b3. And I gave this an exclam because I really like the concept of this move. He's preparing bishop c4. This does compromise some of the squares around his king, like c3 and a3, and also it gives black a hook to work with a4. But this idea of bishop c4, repositioning the bishop to hit the e6 pawn, and also opening the attack on the d6 pawn is worthwhile. So I like that decision by him. Black responded with rook g8, attacking the pawn on g2. White played g3, king e7. So Caruana decides to defend this pawn on f6 and also connect his rooks. When you play king e7, you know you're in it for real because your king is never getting out of the center unless it's probably on the run trying to escape some counterattack from white. So the die has really been cast here. Black's rolling with their king in the center and hoping for the best. So Karjakin continues with bishop c4, this repositioning. And here, Caruana plays bishop e3. I didn't particularly like this move when I saw it. I thought it looked a little cumbersome. I was analyzing a couple other possibilities, like I think the engine's like rook g4, attacking the pawn on e4. Also a4 is a possibility, just looking to get something started on the queen side. You can see it's not entirely clear like which wing black should be focusing on. I think the situation is already so tangled that you're not going to get a clear answer even when looking at it with the engine. But something about bishop e3, it just seems a little awkward to me. I can understand he's trying to control some dark squares, and in particular, this move stops knight d4 for the time being, but I'm just skeptical of it. So here, Karjakin responded with rook f3, and I give that move a dubious mark. I think knight f4, as was suggested by many commentators, was just a better move. This opens up the possibility of knight takes h5, because the black queen is trying to defend both of these points, the pawn and the bishop on e3. So I kind of also wonder why Karjakin didn't play this. I was wondering about e5 earlier, and to me, knight f4 seems like a move he may have wanted to play as well. But he goes rook f3. Black responds with rook g4, hitting the pawn. And now queen f1, attacking f6. Now, rook takes e4, rook takes f6 is out of the question for black. Their king would be ripped to shreds in this case with rook f7 coming. So black must take a moment to defend the pawn, and he plays rook f8. And Karjakin plays knight f4, getting this move in just one move later. And now after bishop takes f4, white faces a decision about which way to recapture. That knight had to be eliminated. I think the pressure it generates on e6 and also the h5 pawn was too significant. So Caruana decides to take it. And here again, I think the path that Karjakin took in this game was correct because g takes f4 and rook takes f4 are pretty close in value. I know the engine didn't find much of a difference between those two moves, but in my opinion, the move that Karjakin played, rook takes f4, was correct. Just keeping it simple, offering a trade of rooks and trying to maintain the attack down the f-file. G takes f4 would produce more of a unbalanced struggle. White could argue that this props up a potential e5 move, but e5 could seriously confuse matters and possibly not in white's favor. So I like the decision just to play rook takes f4. And I believe by this point that Svidler versus Anand game had been drawn, is either right around here or shortly after. And probably since both those guys were keeping an eye on that game, they knew it was headed for a draw. So Karjakin knows that a draw is a good result for him. So Caruana decides to keep pressing. He plays a4, creating some tension on the queen side. And Karjakin takes on a4. This move appears to be pretty ugly. He fractures his queenside and voluntarily accepts double isolated pawns. But I do think it was a good move. Black recaptures, bishop takes a4. And now queen d3. So just getting the queen off the back rank. It's not strictly necessary to defend that rook on f4 anymore. And instead he has his sight set on the d6 pawn. So Caruana moves the bishop back to c6. And now bishop b3. A good securing move. Making sure that a2 and c2 are well defended. This also creates some possibility of using the c4 square in the future, as we'll see. Caruana plays rook g5. I thought it was also possible to play queen e5, because I mentioned earlier that the queen might want to come to this square in order to blockade and also exert some influence from the center. But the problem with moving the queen here is that it allows white the opportunity to play queen c4, hitting the bishop on c6 and also the pawn on b4. And even just the battery against e6 is kind of unpleasant. So as much as Caruana would like to settle the queen on e5, it just wasn't quite working here. So he plays rook g5. And here comes a very interesting moment. Karjakin decides to play e5. And as I wrote here, it's breakthrough time. This is a move that was alluded to earlier, and at long last, he decides to play it. So with the queen on d3, this works perfectly because the queen is opened up against h7. And I admire Karjakin's bravery. I mean, even though a draw was good enough for him, he's not playing scared. He's not going to sit back and avoid sacrificing a pawn in a circumstance where he otherwise might. So e5, and black has various ways to respond. We're actually going to quickly look at every single possible capture here. Caruana decides to take with a rook. So let's run through these possibilities. If d takes e5, then I think rook c4 is strong, driving the queen away, and you'll notice that the d6 square is extremely vulnerable. That e5 move also made way for the rook to swing across, and with d takes e5, rook c4, white is highlighting that possibility. I think black is just busted here because after something like queen b6, queen d6 check, and the bishop is falling. So that's no good. If f takes e5, then queen h7 check is going to be pretty painful. King e8, rook takes f8, king takes f8, rook f1 check. White's rook joins the attacking equation, and I think black is not long for this world. For instance, let's say king e8, queen h8. If king e7, this looks like checkmate in 2 to me. Queen f8 followed by rook f7. So he simply cannot allow both major pieces to infiltrate his position and cause destruction. That would be too much. The queen coming to h7, black can maybe handle, but if one of the rooks gets involved as well, the black king is going to be falling on its sword. So d takes e5 and f takes e5 both end poorly for black. If queen takes e5, rook c4 is again strong, swinging over and attacking the bishop. Let's say bishop d7, rook c7 could be played, pinning black along the 7th rank. And white is only down 1 pawn and has tremendous compensation for it. You can see that bishop a4 could be a threat. Also, white is still keeping in mind queen h7. That's another threat. Just imagine if white were able to play queen h7. So let's just play some random move like d5, maybe hitting the rook on c7. Check, rook f7, rook takes d7 is crushing. White's going to pick up a piece. So the tactics start to cascade in white's favor after e5, which is a huge reason to play this move in the first place. So Caruana chooses the best reply. He plays rook takes e5. Rook c4, hitting the queen. I think he could try queen h7 check, inducing rook f7, and then play queen h8 and have his queen kind of lurking behind enemy lines. But again, Karjakin decides to keep that threat in reserve. So plays rook c4, hitting the queen. And here, Caruana replies with a counterattacking move, rook d5. Understandable because he needs to cover d6. As we saw in a previous line, if the queen moves away somewhere, then queen takes d6 is lights out. So rook d5 was played. Now here I'm going to pose a question to you guys. So imagine you're in Sergey Karjakin's position. And you're in the final round of the candidates tournament. You're playing your closest rival, the only guy who could take that spot from you, and a draw is sufficient. So if you need a draw here, what move would you play as white? And I know this position is complicated, so take your time. If you want to pause your video, you can do that. But what do you think white should play? Okay, so knowing the circumstances of the event, when I was playing through this game, having not looked at any of the analysis yet, I thought that queen takes d5 would be played. Because after queen takes d5, rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, white gets to win back their pawn, rook takes b4. And I figured that this endgame was roughly level. Turns out, I looked at it a little bit with the engine later, after bishop f3, there's kind of an unclear but level position. So that assessment seems to be correct, that it would be about equal from here. But the game goes on, black gets to transition to an endgame, and you know Caruana's not going to give up the half point easily. He's going to try to press his chances and see if he can squeeze a win out of this. It is pretty imbalanced. I mean, black has 4 pawns and a distinctly different structure than white does, even though it's rook and bishop against rook and bishop. I think anything could happen from here. So even though queen takes d5 is the simplifying line, I really like the fact that Karjakin did not play it. That kind of shows his nerves in this game, and really his nerves he's had in the past year or so. I remember when he beat Peter Svidler in the World Cup from a pretty improbable situation, actually. I was impressed by how Karjakin handled himself under pressure. And here, instead of going for kind of the easy way out with queen takes d5 and just trying to hold that endgame, he decides to keep the attack going. He plays queen e2. And I thought that was deserving of a question mark, even though, again, the computer doesn't find much of a difference between queen e2 and queen takes d5. It says it's roughly equal in both cases. But he's willing to play a pawn down because he believes in his attacking chances. One thing I didn't check in this game was the time situation. I do believe that Caruana was experiencing some time pressure leading up to move 40, so that might have also factored into Karjakin's decision. Just keep more tension in the position as the clocks are ticking down. So here, black plays queen b6, retreating the attacked queen. And now Karjakin swings the rook over to h4, uncovering the bishop's attack on d5 and also the pawn on e6, and hitting h5. Caruana plays rook e5 in reply. I also looked at rook takes d1. I think Sagar Shah recommended that on chessbase.com as well. He gave the line rook takes d1, queen takes d1, rook h8, trying to simplify the position. And Shah's contention is that after rook takes h5 and the swap of the rooks, black might even be a bit better in the endgame with this move bishop e8 at the end of the line, because the more pieces that get swapped off, the safer the black king becomes. And here, this is pretty imbalanced as well. White has a passed h-pawn. Black has this central mass that's surviving. But maybe this would have been better for Caruana compared to the game. As played, however, rook e5, black is shuttling this rook along the 5th rank. Karjakin plays queen to d3, attacking the pawn on d6, and again, the queen takes up this post where it can eye the h7 square. And here I think Caruana probably should have played d5. I think he was hesitant to do this because it does shut in the black bishop a little bit. He instead decides to play bishop g2, which seems like an attempt to play d5 without that bishop getting contained by the pawns. You know, maybe he wants to sink the bishop to e4 thereafter once he's established the pawn. But now comes a decisive moment in the game. So white plays rook to d4. Black responds with d5. He can't really have this rook help out in defending the d-pawn. If rook d8, queen h7 is again killer. So he needs that rook on f8 so that he can always respond to queen h7 check with rook f7. So now d5. Karjakin plays the precise queen d2, hitting this pawn on b4. You know, he is down a pawn, so he might like to seize that pawn if he gets a chance. And now here is the key moment in the entire game. So in time pressure, Caruana plays rook e4. And this turns out to be a big mistake. It was better to play bishop e4 or perhaps bishop f3, hitting that rook on d1. But rook e4 was the move. And here, if you haven't seen this game yet, and you want to try to figure out what Sergey Karjakin did in this position, you can do so now. So feel free to pause your video and figure out how white should play. So here's where Karjakin uncorked a combination that I'm sure he'll remember for a very long time. Rook takes d5, sacrificing the rook in the middle of the board. Gotta admire his nerves and the ability to calculate under pressure and just execute. Rook takes d5, and he had it all worked out. So after e takes d5, which is forced, black definitely cannot avoid capturing this rook. Rook d7 is already a huge threat. So takes, and now queen takes d5. White is threatening this e-paulette mate with queen d7 checkmate. And there's only so few ways that black can respond to this. In the game, Caruana played queen c7, but let's just cycle through some possibilities. If rook d8, trying to contest the d7 square, then black gets mated in a different way. Queen f7 checkmate. If f5, trying to make an escape square for the king to f6, then there's the simple line, queen d7 check, king f6, rook d6, winning the queen. Even though black has two rooks for the queen, their king is too exposed. Here, white is even forking the king and the rook. After, say, king g7, I think there's a number of ways white could proceed. I think queen d2 was the strongest according to the engine, trying to go over to g5. Even queen d7 check would probably win here because black can scarcely afford to accept a perpetual. Remember, he needs to win. So that wasn't working for black either, playing f5. What else? Rook d4 is apparently objectively the best move. The computer gives this as the only try for black. But after queen takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, black is down a pawn in an utterly depressing endgame that he has no chance of winning whatsoever. So you can sympathize with Caruana at this point. He's not going to defend a pawn down ending when only a win will suffice. So he tries to keep the rook. He plays queen to c7. And here, Karjakin continues. Queen f5. So his queen is roving around. F7 is covered and E7 is covered, and so is, or E6 is covered, and so is D7, but he finds a new way to harass the black king with this queen F5 idea. When I was going through this game, I was kind of wondering why queen takes H5 should not be played, but the difference, I believe, is that queen takes H5 might allow rook E6, blocking the diagonal, and queen F5, on the other hand, still threatens that check on h7 and also keeps two pieces trained on the e6 square. So rook e6 would now just get checkmated after queen takes e6. So that shows you how precise he was, Karjakin, in the clutch, seeing this difference between queen f5 and queen takes h7. So after queen f5, Caruana played rook f7. This move is agony, but there's really nothing better for black. Again, I'll just show you some possibilities. If rook h8 trying to cover the h7 square, then white's going to creep closer. Queen g6. Now he's threatening a check on g7. And if, say, king f8 trying to cover that, queen takes f6. Black can't even go to g8 because the bishop covers that square, so king here. And white to move can force checkmate in a really cute way. Doesn't even have to pick up the rook on h8. He can play rook d8 check, queen takes d8, queen f7 checkmate. That would have been a nifty conclusion. If not rook h8, I also looked at queen c6, then check, king e8, queen takes h5. The attack is continuing, king e7. Here, bishop d5 is very strong, forking the queen and the rook. White could also, for practical purposes, even repeat the position if they wanted, queen h7 check. So that's failing for black. Just really no good moves. Probably rook h8 is, as I already covered, is the only logical try to stop queen h7, aside from the move that Caruana played. So he went rook f7, but here Karjakin simply snatched the rook. Bishop takes f7. Black played queen e5. The bishop is untouchable. If king takes f7, there's a couple moves that would do the trick. Probably easiest is queen h7 check, just skewering the king to the queen. Go pick up that undefended queen on the next move. Rook e5, trying to counterattack the white queen would fail to queen h7. White's not even down any material. In fact, he's up a pawn, and he's continuing his decisive attack for free. So black attempted queen e5, but here rook d7 check was played. King f8, rook d8 check, and this was the end of the line. Caruana resigned because it is forced checkmate. And let's just show that checkmate how it could play out. If king takes f7, then queen h7 check, king e6, and now the lovely queen d7 checkmate, taking away the flight square on f5. Game over. So a pretty abrupt conclusion once rook takes d5 was played. I can just imagine the tension in that Moscow atmosphere. And things just happened really fast after Karjakin found this killer blow, rook takes d5. And the best that black has is to try to bail out with this rook d4 move on move 38, but we all know what would happen after that. Karjakin is not going to lose this. He might offer a mercy draw, or Caruana might offer a draw, because black is never in a million universes winning this position. So, as played, Caruana decided to go down in flames, as you saw, and white continued this attack down a rook and just executed brilliantly and didn't make any mistakes whatsoever. So, full credit to Sergey Karjakin. He played a great game here. Just to highlight some of the decisions that I was impressed by in this game, I like how he kept it simple throughout. He might have made a couple mistakes, like that. There was that e5 possibility right here, as played in that Prenstetter versus Kojal game. That seems to be strong for white. He played instead rook hf1. But Karjakin, it seemed like he never gave himself a truly difficult decision. There was no point in this game where he had to make a life or death decision, especially in regards to his king safety. His was always the safer king, whereas Caruana's was the one in the firing line. But also credit to Caruana, because he gave himself chances. He played an unbalanced variation. This is not a line that he's going to play every day against Karjakin. He rose to the occasion. He didn't try to wait around and see what happens if Anand could miraculously win against Fidler with black. He took his destiny into his own hands and gave it his best. So I feel bad for Caruana, but also full credit to Sergey Karjakin. He really deserves this. With 8.5 out of 14, he played a great tournament, and I am very much looking forward to his match against Magnus Carlsen in November. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed my analysis of this thrilling final round game in Moscow. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Hope you guys have a good week. Bye.